The day I realized someone had been planning to take everything my father ever built. He had been gone for exactly 72 hours. His coffee mug was still sitting on the garage workbench where he had left it. The old Ohio State flannel he wore every single morning was still folded over the back of his chair, and my sister-in-law was already standing at our kitchen counter sliding a thick stack of legal documents toward me with a smile that had absolutely no business being on the face of a woman in mourning. This is the story of what I did next, and I'm going to need you to stay with me until the very end, because what I uncovered in the days that followed changed everything I thought I knew about the people I had called my family. My father, Walter Hargrove, died on a Tuesday morning in October in the garage of our family home on the west side of Columbus, Ohio. He was 74 years old. When the paramedics arrived, they found the ignition key to his very first delivery truck clutched in his right hand, a 1987 Ford F2, 150 navy blue and faded with 340,000 miles on it, and a dent on the passenger door. He always said had a story behind it. They had to ease the key from his fingers one at a time. He held on all the way to the end, the way he held on to everything in this life that truly mattered to him. The garage smelled the way it always smelled: motor oil, damp Ohio oak, and the strong dark Folgers coffee he brewed every morning before the sun came up over the Columbus skyline. On the wall behind his workbench hung an old hand-drawn map of Ohio covered in red ink circles, every single one of them a delivery route he had personally driven in the early years in the dark and the cold on roads that did not care how tired or how broke he was. In 1987, Walter Hargrove walked into a local bank with $800 in a borrowed envelope and walked out with a loan, a used truck, and a route. By the time he passed Hargrove Freight and Logistics, had 47 trucks, 3 warehouses across Ohio and Indiana, 78 employees, and a value of $12 million. He never showed up late. He never left a load unfinished. He never complained, not once, not in 37 years. He was the kind of man that this country was quietly built on the shoulders of. My name is Margaret Hargrove, and most people have always called me Maggie. I'm 52 years old, and I spent my whole life learning how to be steady from watching that man. He used to say, "Maggie, when the truck breaks down, you fix it. You do not cry in the cab." I carried those words with me every single day of my adult life, and when the people who were supposed to grieve beside me turned out to be the very ones I needed to fight, those were the only words that kept me from falling apart. What do you do when the people who should be drowning in sorrow are already counting what you are worth? Stay with me, because I have never told this story out loud before, and I am telling it now, because people who build honest lives deserve to have someone stand up for them, even after they are gone. If your father ever showed you that quiet strength is the most powerful kind there is, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel, because this story ends exactly the way my father always said the truth does. It comes home. The answer to that question began in our own kitchen on the evening of my father's funeral, with the smell of a neighbor's chicken casserole still thick in the air, and white chrysanthemums sitting in the window where my mother used to grow her herbs. I had barely changed out of my dress when I heard Diane's heels on the hallway floor, that slow, deliberate sound that belongs to a person who is not grieving, a person who has somewhere to be. She walked in wearing a perfectly tailored black blazer that had never seen a single tear, and she set a thick manila folder down on my father's kitchen table, the way you set down a declaration, not a request. Printed across the top page in bold type were the words "Emergency Succession and Power Transfer Agreement." The document proposed to hand full executive control of Hargrove Freight and Logistics to my 19-year-old nephew Tyler, effective immediately, with Diane overseeing all daily operations on his behalf. My brother Nathan stood in the doorway behind her, hands deep in his pockets, staring at the floor. There was no grief in his eyes. There was fear. I picked up the folder, turned to the first page, and said as calmly as I could manage, "I have been running deliveries since I was 15 years old, Diane. I think I know how to read a contract." She smiled, and that smile told me everything I needed to know about the days that were coming. I did not sleep that night. I was back at the Hargrove Freight parking lot by 5:45. The next morning, my breath fought in the cold Ohio air, and when I swiped my master keycard at the financial archive room, the reader beeped once and flashed red. "Access denied." I pressed it again. Red. a third time holding the card flat against the panel, read. Then I heard footsteps from down the corridor, and Travis Mercer, our chief financial officer, appeared looking far too polished and far too awake for that hour. Suit jacket on. I nodded. He told me the security system was undergoing an overhaul, that Nathan had ordered it, and that I should be home resting. Then he looked at me and said, "You need to take care of yourself, Margaret." I went very still inside. He called me Margaret. In 30 years, not one single person at this company had ever called me Margaret. My father's drivers called me Maggie. The woman at the front desk on Tuesdays called me Maggie. Travis Mercer, 6 years in the office, 3 doors down the hall, had just called me by the name of a stranger reading off a file. That was the moment I understood what this actually was. This was not about grief. This was about money. I walked past him without a word and went straight to my father's office at the end of the hall. I locked the heavy door behind me and crouched down to the bottom drawer of his desk, where a small biometric scanner was set flush into the wood, something he had shown me once when I was very young and never mentioned again. I pressed my thumb to it. It clicked open. Inside, resting on a folded cloth, was a dusty external hard drive. My father had spent years quietly coding a private-backed or into the Hargrove freight server, an invisible mirror of every financial record the company had ever processed, hidden where no standard system administrator would ever think to look. He had never told anyone it existed, but he had added my thumbprint to the scanner. He knew. He always knew. I was connecting the drive to my personal laptop when my phone rang. Ohio State Wexner Medical Center. Tyler had been in a serious motorcycle accident on Interstate 71. Severe blood loss. Come immediately. The emergency room was cold and hard and bright, the kind of light that makes everyone look a little hollow. I found Diane near the waiting room windows, pacing and typing on her phone, not crying. Nathan sat in a plastic chair with his face buried in his hands. The doctor came out and explained that Tyler was AB positive, and that the hospital's supply of his blood type was critically low, that the family needed to donate right away. AB positive. I let that sit for a moment in the middle of that bright hallway. My father was type O. My mother was type O. Nathan, as their biological son, was type O. Dan was type A. 2 parents carrying those blood types cannot produce a child with AB positive blood. That is not a matter of medical opinion. That is basic biology, the kind taught in every high school science class in Columbus, Ohio. I turned and looked at my brother. My brother didn't look confused. He looked like a man who had just heard the sound of 30 years of lies beginning to collapse. He couldn't look at me. He stared at the linoleum floor the same way he used to when we were kids. And he had broken something he was never supposed to touch. Except this time, what he broke wasn't a window. It was everything. I drove home from that hospital in silence, the October air cold through the open car window, and my brother's face fixed in my mind. I did not cry. My father's voice came back to me the way it always does when things fall apart. "Maggie, when the truck breaks down, you fix it. You do not cry in the cab." And so instead of crying, I started thinking. That evening, I made a pot of home-style chicken soup and drove it out to Nathan's house in Powell, Ohio, the way any concerned aunt would do after a family emergency. Tyler was in his room, his injured leg propped on pillows, noise-canceling headphones over his ears, nearly asleep. I left the soup on his nightstand and quietly stepped into his attached bathroom and found exactly what I was looking for. His blue electric toothbrush sat in the ceramic holder by the sink, the bristles still damp. I sealed it into a sterile bag I had brought in my coat pocket, careful never to touch the bristle end. In the mudroom near the garage, Nathan's gym jacket hung on its usual hook right where habit had always put it. I lifted 2 dark hairs from the collar roots clean and intact and sealed them into a second bag. I was back in my car in under 6 minutes. By 5 the next morning, I had personally delivered both samples to a private genetics laboratory in Dublin, Ohio, paid for a 48-hour expedited analysis, and was back at my father's office with the hard drive open on my screen. What I found on that server was not a single mistake. It was a system carefully designed and patiently built. 4 shell companies, all registered in Nevada, all carrying names that sounded exactly real enough to disappear inside a standard corporate expense report. Summit Freight Consultant, Apex Supply Chain Solutions, Cornerstone Logistics Partners, and Meridian Distribution Group. None of them existed in any meaningful way beyond a file. number, and a bank account. Over 18 months through invoices for consulting services, never rendered software, never purchased, and freight routes, never driven. Those four names had quietly absorbed $4.1 million from Hargrove Freight and Logistics. The money did not come from our operating revenue. It came from the Employee Retirement Fund, from the pension savings of 78 truck drivers, warehouse managers, and dispatchers who had spent years trusting that someone responsible was watching over what they had earned. Then I found the transaction dates, and I had to set my hands flat on the desk to keep them still. The first wire transfer had gone out on the exact same day my father first sat in a cardiologist's office and heard the words heart disease. While I was holding his hand in that waiting room, Travis Mercer was draining the retirement savings of every man who had ever driven a truck for Walter Hargrove. They had used my father's illness as a distraction and his suffering as cover. Following morning, I walked into the small, spare office of Raymond Cole, former FBI special agent who had spent 20 years working financial crimes before going into private practice in a quiet block on the industrial west side of Columbus. I gave him 72 hours and a blank check and told him to start with Travis Mercer. What he brought back to me changed the shape of everything. Enrollment records from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio showed that Diane and Travis had first met as students 18 years ago, had lived together for 2 full years after graduation, and had maintained a continuous relationship every year since, including all the years Diane had been married to Nathan. The DNA results confirmed the rest. Tyler was Travis Mercer's biological son at 99.998% certainty. Then Raymond slid a single printed email across his desk written by Nathan to Diane 10 years ago. Nathan had known since Tyler was still an infant that a severe childhood fever had left him permanently sterile. He had known that Tyler was not his biological son. He had chosen to raise him in silence and keep the secret buried inside the marriage because he was terrified that if my father ever learned the truth, the bloodline clause in the family trust would strip him of every dollar he had spent his life believing he was owed. Nathan was not a victim of any of this. He had been Diane's willing partner in it from the very beginning. That same evening, I called my brother. I let my voice go quiet and small, let a careful tremble into it, and said, "Nathan, I cannot do this alone anymore. I am ready to sign the papers." I heard the relief pour out of him in a single long breath, that unmistakable exhale of a man who believes he has just escaped something enormous. After I hung up, I drove to the office of Ellen Shaw, corporate attorney I had trusted for years on Hargrove Freight contracts, and we spent the rest of the evening with 2 agents from the FBI white-collar crime division laying out every piece of evidence: the server records, the Nevada shell companies, the DNA results, the photographs, and Nathan's email. The trap was fully set for Friday morning. I spent the Thursday night sitting alone in my father's chair in his office, the old Ohio road map still on the wall behind me, covered in all those little red marks. Every single one of them was a route he had driven himself in the dark and the snow long before anyone was paying attention. I sat there in the quiet, and I thought, Dad, I learned from the best. It is time to drive this one home. Friday morning came gray and still over Columbus, and I stood in front of the mirror in my father's office and put on a polo shirt I had found in the bottom of his closet, navy blue, 2 sizes too large, with Hargrove Freight and Logistics stitched in gold thread above the chest pocket. It was his. I did not need a power suit to walk into that room. I needed his name on my chest. Diane was already seated at the head of the conference table when I arrived. Travis to her right, Nathan pale and quietly sweating on her left, Tyler at the far end with his eyes fixed on his phone. The thick succession agreement folder was pushed across the walnut surface toward me, a heavy gold pen resting on top of it, placed there with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering a final move. Payne looked at me and said, "Your father is gone, Margaret. This is just business now." I picked up that pen. I held it in my hand for one full moment, and then I set it back down on the table without signing a single word. I said, "No, Diane. This is his life's work, and I am not done yet." The door opened before she could respond, and Ellen Shaw walked in with 2 federal agents behind her. Ellen placed the sealed genetics laboratory report at the center of the table and read the conclusion aloud for everyone present. Probability of paternity 0.00%. Tyler was not Nathan's biological son. Nathan's own email from 10 years ago was read next, every line of it, in front of the entire room. Then the agent stepped forward. Travis and Diane were placed under arrest for federal wire fraud and the criminal embezzlement of $4.1 million from the Hargrove Freight Employee Retirement Fund. Diane did not go quietly. She fought, she shouted, and she kept screaming as they walked her out of the boardroom and down the long corridor toward the exit. She screamed all the way down the hallway, and for the first time in 3 weeks the building was quiet enough that I could almost hear my father humming along to the country radio in the garage. Nathan lost his company title, his salary, and the house in Powell that my father had quietly helped him buy. I looked at my brother as all of it was laid out before him, and felt no anger, only the cold, clean clarity of something finally settled. He had made his choices. Tyler, though, was 19 years old, and had not chosen any part of what had been built around him. I walked over to where he sat, looking completely hollowed out, and I said, "Tyler, you did not choose the family you were born into, but you do get to choose who you become now." I paid 1 full year of his college tuition and his basic living expenses, enough to give him solid ground to stand on, and nothing beyond that. The rest of his path was his own to walk. In the months that followed, all $4.1 million were recovered from an offshore account and returned in full to the retirement fund of every driver, dispatcher, and warehouse worker who had ever trusted Hargrove Freight with their future. Thomas Bradley, 22 years, my father's most loyal colleague, was brought back as VP of Operations with a long overdue promotion. The Hargrove Working Families Foundation was established to fund college scholarships for the children of trucking and logistics workers across Ohio, named in my father's honor. 40% of the company was placed into an employee stock ownership plan, so the people who had actually built Hargrove Freight would own a real piece of what their labor had created. The company kept its name. It always will. It just finally belongs to the people who earned it. That afternoon, after the last document was signed and the last call was made, I walked alone across the empty warehouse yard and climbed up into the cab of truck number 1. The leather smelled of old wear and faint gasoline, and there was a coffee ring faded into the dashboard from 30 years of the same mug set in the same spot before sunrise. I put both hands on the steering wheel right where his hands had always been, and I sat there for a long time without moving. No tears, just peace, deep and steady and real. He never let go of what mattered, and neither will I. If this story meant something to you, if you have ever had to fight for someone you loved, or stand guard over what they left behind, please leave a comment below. I read every single one, and if you want more stories about real people who refuse to be buried by the ones who should have loved them, subscribe to this channel. My father always said that the truth always finds its way home. Thank you so much for being here with me today.